I was actually coming from the High Plains Dairy Conference, and I wound up participating in a panel that I did not intend to participate in, but it was addressing silage production with limited water. So exactly what everyone's facing here. And forage sorghum was the topic. Harold recommended Brady and Gibson, so that was fantastic. He talked about the challenges of producing forage sorghum, the challenges of harvesting forage sorghum. What was amazing was there was a panelist that was from Shear, and he was talking about the new processors that are going to be available for forage sorghum, especially to ensure that we get those berries processed. So we lessen that concern with regards to just starch availability and the energy of that forage. Now, I will say agronomically, I don't think it's necessarily a berry processing problem as much as it is a harvest timing problem. I know we can handle these forage sorghums if we harvest them on time, but manage the maturity classes as well. So I will talk about a lot of that in today's meeting. So of course, forage production. Now, this presentation might be a year late. You know, we look at the contracts that are not available this year that were available last year, year before last, just because of, you know, less forage available, record prices, all of that. A lot of forage put up last year, so there's not as many opportunities for forage sorghum. In the last week, I have talked to several producers who have been renegotiating actually their wheat silage contracts. And one of the things they've been able to do is actually really push a protein basis. So I would say with anybody, if you can actually get a dairy to pay you a premium for protein, and especially going into this boot stage where we are going to be in, you know, the next 2 months, and they pay a premium on that stage. You know, you can put in some UAN, go through your pivot, boost that protein. You're gonna save probably 3 to 4 inches of water, and we'll talk about that. Plus, you get a harvest earlier, you're gonna come out dollar for dollar, and in addition to that savings in water. So lots of opportunities. So forage, though, as we look at the need for forage, the demand for forage, the potential ability to save water, I really do think it's a very good fit as we move forward. Also, when we step back and just consider the history, I think that is so interesting to look at this historical data. And first and foremost, when research was conducted in this region, it was actually forage based. And you know, as we have expanded into irrigated production, you know, everything switched to corn and our feed grains, and you know, more recently into cotton. But it's almost like we're kind of going back to that historical research. And as I mentioned, theoretically, we're using less water with forage, but it does depend on the management. And what we do see in these continuous forage systems, when we're removing all that residue, we're not protecting the soil, we have those evaporative losses, but we also have a reduction in soil structure, we have poor infiltration, we don't have the soil water storage. So that kind of in the, you know, year over year, we have to think about how that's impacting our subsequent years. And then, of course, that depends on the crop selection, hybrid selection, variety, whatever we're growing, all those problems that I just mentioned. So, history. It is so interesting to me when we think about, you know, in reality, we're kind of, you know, 100 years pre-Dust Bowl. 1920s was, I mean, the epitome of crop production for this region. You know, we had people coming out, breaking out virgin land and making record wheat crops. And the price at that time was actually pretty good. And so, you know, we had this opportunity, but even back before that, when Powell was, you know, doing his expeditions west, and of course he's who, you know, mapped, you know, Colorado River and went through and looked at all these waterways and really defined this western region for the U.S. He crossed the 100th meridian in 1878, and he said, crop production west of the 100th meridian is not going to be possible without irrigation. Now, we step back and go, well, that's, you know, pretty bold statement for 1878, but we have to think about they already had canal systems throughout Europe, and they were irrigating. They were already, you know, having canal systems in California. I know that, you know, we could speak to that in the back. He's familiar with, you know, just the history of irrigation. So he recognized this. You know, this was the great American desert. And so we go back east a little bit, though, and go to right here, and this would be about Oklahoma City. This is the point where the rainfall is in excess of our environmental demand. So if we think about just the environment, the heat, the wind, what drives that transpirational pump in those plants, it's not till we get east of Oklahoma City that we have rainfall that exceeds that. Now, of course, we know there's a lot of irrigation going in throughout the Mississippi. There's even irrigation going in the I-states because there are these periodic droughts. And irrigation stabilizes production even if we're in a humid region. But as we move west, our precipitation does not meet our annual water demand. You know, we get right here in Dumas, Texas, and we're looking at an environmental demand of about 90 inches per year. And we're lucky if on average we get 18 inches of rain a year, and with rain and snow, so there's a precipitation. So, you know, we have this very hot, dry, windy, effective environment. So, 1878. You know, this isn't going to happen, people. You know, Powell's, you know, waving the flag, warning people you're not going to grow crops out there. But by 1888, there was over 4 million acres in the high plains, you know, from Kansas south, that was already in production. You know, there were these advertisements. We know about the story about Boy City and, you know, just how people were lured in with, you know, streets that were paved in gas lanterns. So, but you know, there was the Homestead Act and people were coming west. But there was actually a drought in the late 1880s, and at that point people are like, yeah, no, this is not a good environment for dryland crop production. So half of the population of western Kansas actually had departed during this 4-year period from 1888 to 1892. So we have the Homestead Act, people coming west, and then they realized this isn't going to work. So if we fast forward a couple years, you know, the U.S. government at that time realizes if people are actually going to go west, we have to figure something out. So there was a man who, his name was Lyman Briggs, and he was actually an engineer, physicist, agronomist, soil scientist, and it was with the USDA Physics Laboratories, the Bureau of Soils at the time. And he established the first field station in Dalhart, Texas in 1910, which I think is absolutely amazing. I mean, I don't know why there's not a historical marker up there marking that there was an early research station in Dalhart in 1910. If we back up a little before that, he in 1906 actually did the soil classification, or did a classification system for soils based on soil moisture. You know, and he recognized that soil texture was extremely important. You had to know what your soil texture was going to be to determine what the moisture equivalent was. How much water can that soil actually hold? And so they did put together these research stations from Dalhart all the way north into South Dakota to evaluate what the crop water use of forages was going to be. And they focused on forages because as settlers came west, they brought livestock. Livestock was necessary for food, for transportation. You know, that was really what drove the systems of that era. So they focused on forages. And the USDA library actually still has these in its archives. This was his work that includes that original data from Dalhart, the water requirement of plants, investigations in the Great Plains in 1910 and 1911. And so in some ways, it was actually, you know, very crude, rudimentary, just the mass balance of soils and plants determined how much water was used. And they had these pictures. And what's interesting, though, I think today, you know, we have soil moisture sensors and we have all this technology, but we still can't get away from just the accuracy of mass balance, weighing a wet soil, drying it, weigh the dry soil. That's going to be the most accurate way to do that. And that's exactly what they did. They actually took old galvanized trash cans, grew broom corn, alfalfa, and different, and I think there was even wheat that was in there. And so they then, based off of mass balance, weighed the before, watered afterward, and determined how much water specific crops used. But it wasn't just in Dalhart. They went up the Great Plains, as I mentioned. And they went from Dalhart, well, I said South Dakota, all the way up to Williston, North Dakota. Now, personally, I have found it extremely challenging just to conduct research across the Texas Panhandle by myself. I can't imagine having to send telegraphs back to Washington, D.C. and have supplies shipped out by train and patiently wait for things to come on time. But what was amazing is that he knew there was this gradient up the Great Plains. And in the literature, it states that he picked these locations because they all sit in a relatively similar precipitation gradient. You're looking at about 18 inches of rain from Dalhart all the way up to Williston, North Dakota. So the question was, and they probably knew just based off of records and reports, that you can grow a lot more native grass usually in North Dakota. I mean, for heaven's sakes, they harvest the bar ditches in South Dakota. So they knew that you were able to produce so much more with that rainfall. And this is actually what they showed. This is looking at alfalfa. And this is the water requirement of alfalfa versus pan evaporation just during the growing season. So really looking at just kind of how much water is needed per gram. He did it on a gram basis because it was weighed. Grams of water per gram of dry matter. And what we see is that you need twice as much water at Dalhart, Texas as you do at Williston, North Dakota. Now, first session we talked about cover crops. And this is exactly why you can have a really good cover crop in North Dakota, and it's very challenging to make a cover crop in the Texas High Plains. And even just going up into Colorado, you know, we talked with researchers in Colorado who've had very good success with cover crops up in that northeastern Colorado area. And yeah, it's a similar climate or it's a rainfall pattern, but it is not as harsh. You don't have the wind and there's those extreme temperatures that really drive that crop water demand. So this is looking at just these isolines with these Class A evaporation. So again, how much water is evaporating from a free body, or how much water is lost, how much evaporation is occurring from a free body of water. You know, so here we are, I just said 90 inches at Dumas, but we're closer to 95. You know, going all the way up, you know, Williston, North Dakota, they're at 50 inches. So it really does speak to, you know, how much water is needed and why we have to be so efficient in this region, just because of the harshness of the climate. Now, irrigation allows us to overcome those challenges, but as long as we don't have the irrigation, we have to rethink how are we going to manage these systems. This is just looking at that pan evaporation just during our growing season. You know, if we think about, you know, pre-irrigation starting in April, you know, the bare soil surface that we talked about in the last session, you know, all the way through, if you're going to, you know, carry that through October through, especially if you're looking at, you know, kernel set and, you know, physiological maturity in grain crops or fiber development, you know, we're looking at twice as much. This is actually from Williston to Bushland, Texas. Nielsen with USDA put this together a couple years ago. It just validates again what that original data showed. So, first and foremost, early research recognized that we have challenges, especially, you know, in this region. So limited forage production potential in the southern Great Plains. So how are we going to best manage that? And irrigation allowed us to overcome all those challenges. But because we have declining groundwater, we now have to decide how are we going to be more strategic? What are we going to do to optimize this return per acre? So, water use and crop selection. So this is actually looking at just the silage acres and kind of an estimate of silage acres. And I think this is interesting because it really shows this inverse. This is actually data that was kind of, I put together from the NAS, looking at quick stats and going in and kind of looking at estimates for both what would be our the whole High Plains districts 10 and 11, which make up that NAS data set. So going from 2015 to 2025, we really do see this inverse in corn silage and sorghum silage. As corn silage has declined, sorghum silage has really come in and picked up a lot of acres. We also see a big change in our wheat silage. And of course, we know with wheat silage, this is actually displacing a lot of that grain production that we historically have had. I know just in visiting with wheat seedsmen that people used to be putting up a lot of seed, and they're selling a lot of seed. So if you want wheat seed, you do have to make sure you get that reserved early, because we're losing a lot of seed production. But the total acreage regionally, we're up over a little over 250,000 acres, over 250,000 acres just in silage. And that's definitely very significant when we just think about what that is doing and what acreage this is actually displacing with regards to grain. And I do think even some cotton acres as well. So this is actually looking at kind of the same principle that we're talking about with regards to Briggs and the water use of forages. This is looking at data that is from Akron, Colorado, as well as Bushland, Texas, and Bozeman, Montana. The y-axis right here is grain yield. The farthest right line would be pounds per acre. And then the line right here across your x-axis is going to be the cumulative ET, the total crop water use. So the top is inches, 5, 10, 15, 20 total inches. So total water use, irrigation plus rainfall plus soil water. Now, thinking about those ISO lines and the pan evaporation, this hot pink line is actually wheat at Bozeman, Montana. This green line right here that's solid would be corn at Akron, Colorado. And then right here, these dots would be corn at Bushland, Texas. Now, what's important about this line, we know that water use and yield increase somewhat linearly. We know that with a lot of crops, because wheat is what would be a C3 crop, it only is going to produce 3 carbohydrates every time it transpires, while as corn's a C4, it's going to produce 4, which is why it has a greater water use efficiency and why you can make so much more yield with it. There's this sweet spot. The more water you have, all of a sudden corn is going to out-yield wheat. It's going to have a higher water use efficiency. It is going to do better. But as we move down this curve and we're in a very limited water environment, we have to think about where are we going to get the greatest bang for our buck. But also from a forage standpoint, where we cross this x-axis is where we are transitioning from vegetative development to reproductive development. So this right here, from a wheat crop standpoint, this is that boot stage. And this actually agrees with the data that we've recently, well, not recently, but last, 5-6 years, collected at Bushland, just to validate this. Same thing with corn. If you're only producing, biomass, fodder, this is what we're talking about right here. By the time you're just in those V stages, you're going to need, in this area, about 10 to 11 inches of water. Now, the thing is, we know from a corn silage standpoint, it's not just the biomass. Those dairies want starch, and to get the starch, you have to have the grain. So this is why we have to move up this line. Now, it would be great if they could just get by with just the biomass, because now we're able to really cut that water in half. But with wheat, especially boot stage wheat, the silage, green chopped wheat, you really can make a very, very good quality crop with very minimal water. And we're talking about a forage that would be comparable to, a very good quality alfalfa. And so, as we think about that, so this is really important. Just kind of keep this in mind as we move forward, these intercepts. So forage, how much forage does this region actually need? And I have not updated this for probably dairy numbers this year, but a couple of years ago, as I stepped back and thought about, okay, we're increasing in forage acreage, how much forage do we really need? At what point are we going to maximize this? Now, of course, I do think, as we consider contracts this year, because of the very favorable conditions last year, we have all this forage put up. But we know right now we are coming out of a December that was very hot and dry. We have had the driest February, I think, on record now. And so this next year, I think, is going to be a very risky corn silage year, and that seems to be the only contracts that are available. So when we think about just forage requirements, a dairy cow needs about 25 pounds of dry matter per day. So about 50% of that ration is made up in very good quality forage. And if we just assume 500,000 dairy cows across the region, which this doesn't account for replacement heifers and dry cows and the whole herd, but just 500,000 cows, that comes out to about 12.5 million pounds, or about 6,250 tons of forage per day. Now, from a beef cattle finishing standpoint, they only need about 5 pounds a day. 5% of that final total mixed ration is actually tied up in forage. And it's really just for the rumen activity, just to make sure that we're keeping everything processed. And because it's such a small fraction, you can get by with a lower energy forage. We're looking at just that fiber fraction to keep this going. Now, we know that we, on average, before the border closed, had about 2.5 million cattle on feed. So that would have been also, coincidentally, 12.5 million pounds of forage. So collectively, we are looking at between those two, that comes out to 25 million pounds of forage every day just for this region. Now, if we're looking at this just from, say, for one industry, 12,500, that should be pounds needed. And if we had a 15-ton dry matter per acre non-stress corn silage crop, that would be 834 acres per day, or 304,000 acres per year. Now, realistically, we're talking about on average 9 tons of dry matter, and that's still for a very, very well managed crop. And so that's going to take us up to about 506,000 acres, but that's only for one of these sectors. So now that we take into account, we know we have the dairy and the beef, we're looking at close to 1 million acres. Now, I showed you right now we're talking about almost 700,000. Well, in order to meet that, we have to think about the land use. Now, for this High Plains trade area, this is some data from Steve and Dee Dee Jones and others with AgriLife. And what they report is that 55% of our acreage is pasture land. When we look at actually the non-ag land, towns, parks, golf courses, that's 10%. Dry land cropland makes up 26%. Our irrigated crops are 9%. And this piece of the pie is getting smaller. So how are we going to make that or double that with this piece of the pie? Yeah, and that should be changed. I have a unit error there, sorry. Okay, so fast forward, we have to be more strategic again. So I actually took this picture a couple of years ago on my way to a master irrigator meeting. This is just down the road. And this is where we had a wheat variety trial just to the east of this on the Resnick farm. And it was interesting as I stood there and looked at this, here we have this residue, this biomass. It's doing everything it's supposed to do. And what's unique about this, there was a snowstorm on January the 8th, and I took this picture on January the 25th. So we're still holding that snow. And this field, it was soft, it was moist, you could walk through it, and it was, doing everything it was supposed to, holding that. Now, just down the road, here we had a picture, or a field that had been in forage. There was no residue left. But as happens this time of year, it's windy, you get, erosion, and you can see the scarring in this picture just from that. And it was dry, very, very dry. So we did not have the storage. So we have to think about, again, as we're managing these forage crops, what are the secondary consequences to that? What are we doing to our soils and our fields? And so I do think that as we think about, we need a lot of acreage, but we also have to be thinking about these rotations or how we're managing residue, raising the cutting bar or something, because this really has some long-term consequences moving forward from a soil moisture standpoint, but then even from a fertility standpoint. So one of the things that we never talk about is potassium. And it's because if we look at our soil analyses, we have a lot of potassium that's theoretically available. Now that potassium, and that's a whole other presentation and topic, that's under ideal conditions. We get into very dry situations, that potassium is not going to be available because of the structure of our clays. But then also when we're just mining all this forage, we're harvesting that potassium. And over time, what potassium would be readily available for the plants that's not locked up between all these clay layers is no longer there. So you get your soil analysis and it still shows 400 parts per million potassium. Now we know that what potassium is for the plant. The potassium is important for converting nitrogen to crude protein. It's involved in enzyme reactions within the plant. It's important for photosynthesis. It's important for cellular structure and standability. It's important for stomatal conductance of the leaves. It's like you drinking Gatorade if you're dehydrated. Potassium is so important for the plant. But when we harvest all this residue, one of the first things to happen when the plant material decomposes is the potassium degrades out of the cell wall of the residue, and it feeds that system, and it's going back into the soil. So what I think we're seeing, when we talk about diseases, and there's a lot of diseases, and I ask our plant pathologists all the time, why now? Why do we have late season decline in corn? And why do we have these problems with corn leaf aphids? And why didn't we see this before? And it's like, well, we just do see it now. I personally think it's because we have a fertility problem, and we have a lot of soils where we think we have a lot of potassium based off of the soil analysis, but that potassium is not readily available because we don't have the irrigation. Potassium is taken up in soil solution, and in dry soils, if that potassium is not in solution, those roots, they're not chewing on anything, they drink, they don't chew. And so it can't access the potassium. And so, you see your sorghum or your corn or your silage, your wheat, it starts to flare later in the season. We think, oh, it's just late season water stress or maybe some nitrogen. Part of that, I guarantee, is secondary potassium deficiencies that we're not taking into account because there is no residue and we're not feeding that system. So that's a whole other issue here, but that's something that's extremely important that we are not addressing as a whole when we talk about continuous forage production. But all that said, silage can make money. It's all about the profit, right? So, considerations for quality silage. How much water do we have? What is the well capacity? How are we managing that? And of course, what is our forecast? And I do think that's for both summer and winter silages. We really do need to be considering that. What is that winter forecast? Because we do know if we have a winter drought, that's really going to impact those small grain forages. End user, big component and decision maker in this. Are there any quality concerns? Sugarcane aphids and spider mites. This is something that I addressed actually in this last meeting. Forage sorghum still has this concern within the industry that we don't want to grow it because of sugarcane aphids. Well, I have been in more than one field that's limited irrigated, and if you are in a limited irrigated corn silage field, and if you're in a limited irrigated corn silage field, more than likely you are risking spider mites flaring. And so in my mind, we're exchanging one pesticide for the other. Yes, you might have spider mites in corn, but you're going to spray and take care of it. And so, in sugarcane aphids, you're going to have to spray in a forage sorghum field too. Now, the benefit that we have in forage sorghum is we have hybrids that have sugarcane aphid tolerance. Also, I think, with some preventative type measures like Savanto in furrow and other activity or other, management decisions, managing planting dates, we can really mitigate the time and maturity in forage. We can mitigate when these sugarcane aphids or the damage from the sugarcane aphids that come in. Our planting windows are broader with forage sorghum, and so on. Harvest windows, etc. So, don't plant a late hybrid if you do not have the time. And I mean, the time to mature that hybrid. Also, I should have said on here, don't plant a late maturing hybrid if you don't have the water. Because that's where we start to see them cannibalize, lodge, all of that. So our forage options, we have our annual forages, corn, wheat, sorghum, and then there are some perennial forages, improved perennials like the Bermuda grass. Lots of interest in cool season forages. Now, those cool season forages have an amazing carrying capacity. It's amazing what you can do, but you also have to have the water because they're cool season. And their water use during the summer, Bamert has one that's really taking off. And it's a great forage, I don't doubt. But again, you're going to have the water. So you're exchanging water for a corn silage crop for one of those cool season forages. Now, some of the improved perennials, even Bermuda grass, we've done some research, and if I haven't gone over time because of rambling, I'll touch on that briefly. But what we have seen is that once we get past the establishment, we can really maintain that. Iron Master Blue Stem, that's one that does well in our higher pH soils. And the thing with the perennial forages is that once you get past that establishment year, and you're not going to get away from water during the establishment year, but once you get it established, you can then convert water, shift it over to a higher water demanding crop, even corn silage, and then maybe with a warm season perennial, maybe put only 6 inches of irrigation on it. And you've really sustained that. You have something to maybe stock earlier ahead when wheat pasture might be ready, maybe even carry calves longer if that wheat pasture runs out. And so it really gives you a lot of flexibility with that. So I do think that as we move into limited water, that becomes a viable option for many people. Okay. Forage selection. So this just, I won't go over this for the sake of time, but just kind of comparing these different forages, our acreage trend, what's driving the selection of these. Now, the driver here for corn silage, high milk and energy. And I don't doubt if we had all the water in the world, corn silage is going to be a premium silage. When we look at the corn silage hybrid trial data, corn silage hybrids are very consistent. We're looking at plus or minus maybe 3 tons. You're going from 32 to maybe 35, 36 tons. Very uniform. The digestibility, you're always 80% or more. I mean, just very good quality. Starch contents that are, on average 35%. So it's easy to select for. It's in a ration from a nutritionist standpoint. It's something that's easy for them to manage. Forage sorghums, what we've seen in our data, and I'll show, is that we're all across the board, but there's a lot of flexibility to mitigate risk and pick hybrids that use less water, and you can really, I think, do a lot more with it. So this total crop water requirement is really key as we think about this. The total crop water for corn silage is going to be at least 27 inches if you're shooting for these higher tonnage yields. And again, maybe 21 inches of irrigation, a little in-season rainfall, a little soil moisture, unless it's double crop forages. But we can get by with a lot less in our sorghum silage. So corn silage, one of the questions that I've actually received quite a bit about is this grain to tonnage ratio. And this is based off of questions, especially with regards to insurance. And there's, claims are made and paid based off of this ratio. And on average, historically, it has been 9 to 10 bushels per ton of forage. And so if you think about, where we stand on this and the impact that we know that good quality corn silage is going to contain grain. And if you do not have the bushel or the water to make the bushels, you're not going to make that tonnage. And so this was actually based off of data from the I-States. And we're still trying to apply that same principle down here. And so it's definitely under ideal conditions. And if so, again, if you don't have the water for grain, you're not going to have the water for that. This is actually a just basic regression based off of data that we had from Bushland, looking at grain yield bushels compared to silage yields across several different years. And so what we have here is, say if we made more of a stress crop, this 150, I pulled this from a data set where we had a Texas Corn Board project looking at 2-gallon water. And so what we're showing here is 150 bushels per acre. That gave us a silage yield of 22.3 tons per acre. That ratio is 6.7, and these ratios are assumed on a wet basis, not a dry matter basis. Now again, if you're going to try and make a 30 plus ton corn silage crop, that would give you a grain yield of around 300 bushels per acre. And so, at that point, I think it's really important to step back and consider what are the markets. The great thing about grain, if you could make that type of tonnage, you're leaving your residue in the field. You're feeding that system, and you're preserving your soil, and there's a lot of benefits to that. So that's where you kind of have to step back and weigh those markets. But I think so many of the dairies are surprised. They come in here and they think they're going to get these corn silage yields that are in excess of 30 tons per acre, but we don't have the water for those grain yields and to achieve that. So that's where we start to see those higher ratios. So when we talk about water stress silage, of course, we're talking about low moisture, high dry matter silage in many cases. And harvest moisture is extremely important for silage packing. We also have to think about pesticides. I am very concerned looking at this year. I have heard that there has been record corn seed sales for this region this year. Now, it's always a good year that gives us confidence. And last year we had moderate temperatures and good in-season rainfall for many producers, and there's been a lot of corn seeds sold. And one of the things that, as we look at this, it's always the great thing about having silage is that the contingency plan can always be silage. Well, if it gets hot and dry in August, I'm just going to chop it, and that's going to be better than taking a hit in grain yield. But if you're going to do that, you have to think about pesticides. Because just because a pesticide is labeled for grain does not mean it's labeled for silage. And if there was to be residue testing, which randomly they do test milk supplies for pesticide residues, you would hate that to come back. So I would say if that's your contingency plan, always look at the pesticide to make sure it is actually labeled for corn silage too. And that's for herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. Also nitrate poisoning. I was really surprised. It probably was 2020, 2021 when it was really dry. And it was the first time I had ever received a call about nitrate toxicity and nitrate levels in corn silage. And again, forage sorghum, is the guy that always has the bad reputation. There's prussic acid, and there's nitrate toxicity, there's lodging, all these things that we discussed with forage sorghum, but that's because of the environment we're growing it in and just how it's being managed. Well, corn silage is susceptible to nitrate toxicity. Any forage, wheat silage can have nitrate toxicity. And especially if you are fertilizing early in the season for high tonnage, and then all of a sudden you get this stress and that plant shuts down, well, what that plant stops doing is converting the nitrogen to the protein, and you have all these nitrates that are still in that plant. And so these nitrates can build up. Now, while we know that nitrates can dissipate in a silage pile, when we have these silage mountains now, that becomes a different story. And I have visited with people on dairies who've managed those, and they say, well, they do feel that they get a lot of off-gassing off of the front, but you still don't want to just assume that is going to happen. So realize that if that's a contingency plan too, soil sampling is so important. Know what your soil levels are. And of course, and I would say when we look at what's going to happen with fertilizer prices moving into the spring, soil sampling is going to pay for itself hands down because of fertilizer prices and nitrogen prices especially. So corn. This is actually that data that I mentioned that was sponsored by Texas Corn Board looking at deficit irrigated corn silage. And this actually was some research that stemmed more from the southwestern panhandle. You get down towards Muleshoe in that area where they just don't have the water. And the question became, how much yield drag and what's going to happen if I'm growing, rather than spreading water completely thin, if I at least have 2-gallon water, what could I do with that? So what we considered were planting dates, May the 17th and June the 15th. Now, I know when we talk about insurance, we talk about June the 5th, but what we do know, and we talked about this in the last session, that we can shift a lot of stress by planting a little later. So we had mid-May and mid-June. Interestingly enough, I have had a guy from Dimmitt tell me that hands down, May 18th is his plant date. Record yields every year if he plants on May 18th. So we're looking at mid-May here for, optimizing that. And then mid-June. Now with the forage harvest though, what we're looking at is with the mid-May, mid to late August, in converse to a mid-September for that late planting. Now with grain, we know we're going to need to take it later. And of course, with grain, we know theoretically if we're going to have the test weight, that kernel set, and have that yield that we want to maintain, as well as that plant health, that stalk health, we're probably going to have to irrigate, or should irrigate if we have the water. But if we don't have the water, what are we going to do? So with this, we had looked at the irrigation. Again, we were restricted to 2 gallons per minute per acre. And so in-season irrigation for the first planting date, 6.8, second came in right at 6.3, maintaining that 2 gallons. In-season precipitation to harvest, it was 8 for the early plant and 7.2 for the late. And then to the grain harvest, we actually did pick up a little with that based off of the planting dates and how it shifted. So this actually kind of looks at the difference in grain yield, what happened, and then with that silage yield. And what we did see that in this low water environment, because of the reduction in grain yield, we actually did have a boost in the return by going with silage. So we had 2 different hybrids at the time. We had 2 different seeding rates also. And what we saw is that there was no difference in seeding rate or silage. We made this seeding rate match that water, 16 and 22,000 seeds per acre. And then with the grain yield, there was no, as I mentioned, there was no difference between that. Now I want to point out we took a really big hit in grain yield that year, and this picture actually, well, no, it doesn't show it. What we had, that was that early starting to dry down. We had late season decline come in, and that really wiped that out. So that kind of goes back to, again, these diseases that we're seeing. And I can't help but think, and I have asked, we were all taught, this disease triangle, how everything interacts, the insects and the disease and the agronomic management. There's this interaction between everything. What can we do to mitigate disease? And the pathologists say that with late season decline and some of these other diseases, there's nothing we can do. But I think there's some fertility in these low water environments that we are ignoring. But nevertheless, even with that very low grain yield, we still saw that the return was greater. So this is looking at the price of grain that year, and the 2022 cash price, it would be nice if it was this again, $6.38 per bushel. Silage, looking at silage prices at $65 per ton. And so for the first planting date, we increased that by anywhere from, depending on what it was, $300 to about $400 per acre. The late planted, because we had a really big hit in grain yield, that was actually greater. So we're looking at about $400 to $570 more per acre in that low water environment. So, I think as we start thinking about this, again, if you don't have the water for grain, silage is probably going to be the way to go. But I do know, then we start hearing dairy say that they are discounting based off of nutritive value parameters, and you're not getting paid based off of what's on the scale. There can always be some issues. But I would always read those silage contracts and make sure there's not anything in there on digestibility, starch levels. You want to get paid on what's going across the scale. Also, of course, there's been discussions in past years about moisture and people being requested to deliver at a lower moisture. Well, if you're getting paid on what's going across the scale and you're delivering something that's 58% moisture, you've just cut 7% off of your price. So always make sure that's in writing too, and everything's brought back to a standard of 65%. As I mentioned, corn silage. Here's looking at corn silage trial from the corn breeder. This is an old trial, but new trials hold the same. They're just very consistent across the board. So is the digestibility. So this kind of leads us to forage sorghum. Why forage sorghum? And I've rambled and I might not have time to go into all the perennial stuff. But so heat and drought tolerant. One of the things that I don't have on here that I think that we should emphasize more is that sorghum also has a lower limit with regards to soil moisture extraction. And it has the ability, the energy to just pull water from lower moisture contents than corn does. So we talk about the rooting depth and the fibrous root system and the ability to extract at deeper depths, but it actually can extract water at a lower moisture content. So if you think about, you have, say, a foot of soil, and your wilting point is going to be at 22%. Well, you know that the probably, what is that? 5 inches of that. You're not going to be. Think about if you assume how much volume you have. Well, I won't do mental math, but you can extract with sorghum actually down to like closer to 20% permanent wilting point, whereas corn's closer to that 22%. So ability to extract at lower depths. Now the downfall to that is it's kind of like a cotton crop that leaves you dry going into the next season, or a wheat crop that is really good like sunflowers. But it will get you through that season and through those tough times for sure. Reduced cost of production, that seed cost. One of the things that this panel discussed at the dairy conference was seed cost and the cost per acre. And so, we're looking at probably a seeding cost for most forage sorghums, I don't know, maybe $20 an acre. Is that reasonable? Whereas corn, we're exceeding that. We're over $100 per acre. So right out the gate, we're looking at a cheaper cost. I will say from a fertility standpoint, ton for ton, you're going to have a very comparable nitrogen requirement for forage sorghum if you're trying to make those higher tons. So I would not recommend cutting back on that unless you are shooting for a more moderate production. But even from a disease standpoint, in the Midwest, all we saw in the popular press was stuff about tar spot. Well, sorghum has a little more disease tolerance. Now, ergot was a really bad thing this past year, but that's definitely environmentally driven. And so, it could be 10 more years before we see that. And that's going to be more susceptible in these male sterile hybrids. In our other hybrids, we just don't see that as frequently because of the you don't have this open flower, it's pollinated, and you have the grain, and that fungal pathogen doesn't get in there. So, but it has to be managed properly. When we think about forage sorghum and the bad reputation, I firmly believe we don't have a product problem, we just have a management problem. And it's the same with grain sorghum. It's kind of this crop we've been able to ignore. Because it is so tough, you can just plant it and forget about it. But if you want to make the yields, whether it's in grain or forage sorghum, a little bit of investment and a little bit of care will really get you far. It's just like any crop. You get what you put into it. But it provides us an opportunity to mitigate risk. So forage sorghum hybrids, they're not all equal, and we see that based off of our yield data. It really is important to evaluate trial data for that reason. One of the things that I really believe is important is evaluating maturity class. And at the Bushland trial, we do report the half bloom date. Now, when you look at any hybrid, forage sorghum or even corn hybrid, it's going to give you whether it's the relative maturity in corn or the maturity class in a forage sorghum, but those are always based off of the region where they're developed. And with forage sorghums, many of these forage sorghums are developed in Costa Rica and the Rio Grande Valley, and so forage sorghum is photoperiod sensitive, so it's going to behave differently up here. So always pay attention to regional data and that half bloom date. Because that's going to give you a better indication of the maturity. Late maturing hybrids, year in, year out, those are the hybrids that are going to have the high yields. And we see those now yield 30 tons or more per acre with very limited irrigation. But you have to have the water to extend that growing season. If you don't have the water, they cannibalize, they fall down, and then you're mad. And then, of course, don't choose a hybrid based off of hybrid characteristics. That's that BMR, and I'll talk about that. Across broad averages, brown midribs are slightly better, slightly more digestible, slightly higher crude protein. But if you look at hybrid by hybrid, there are some really good non-brown midribs on the market. So it's always important to pay attention to hybrids. So when people pick forage sorghums, usually this is kind of how you're doing it. Any hybrid. Number one, it's that yield potential. Then we think about the end user. What is the nutritive value? Harvest timing. And then, of course, what is water? But I think in these water-limited environments, we need to back up and rethink this. First and foremost, it really should be about the water. We need to be matching even our sorghum hybrid to the water that we have. And then think about harvest timing. Because I mentioned, there's these new shear processors that are going to be that are available, and what they have shown is that from a dairy standpoint, they do wind up with like $6 or more per ton greater return in milk production from a dollar standpoint, but harvest timing is so important. We can mitigate a lot of that if we're paying attention to this, and a lot of that then goes into managing those planting dates. Then consider, okay, based off of these characteristics, what is the yield potential that I want to achieve, and then of course that nutritive value component. Now this is how we break out our sorghum silage trial at Bushland based off of maturity. Days to half bloom, less than 70 is going to be a true early hybrid, and that's a fast hybrid. If you think within 70 days you're reaching half bloom, because in 20 more days that's going to be about 67% moisture, and that is ready to chop. So if you could have something that you're in and out of a field in 3 months in, you think about your irrigation window, this is definitely very fast. Now with that, you also have to consider, well, you don't have the yield potential, but when you look at these higher yielding hybrids, you're going to be in the field at least 30 to 40 days or longer to get that. Now photoperiod sensitive hybrids, those are hybrids that don't transition to reproductive development until usually around mid-September. And that's, of course, that's just that panicle moving up in there. And that's because of day length until day length is less than 12 hours. So we're talking about the fall equinox. But they very rarely do produce a grain. If it's a true photoperiod sensitive hybrid, rarely produce a grain head in this region. So half bloom, if you're out in a field, sorghum's going to bloom from the top down. And if you looked at just an individual plant, when 50% of that panicle has bloomed, that would be half bloom, or across a field when 50% of that field has reached a bloom stage. Now the first couple of days of flowering, those anthers are going to be yellow, but as they mature and after they've shed their pollen, they turn brown, turn darker. This is actually looking at just irrigation based off of one of our trials based off of maturity. And 2023 was a very rough year, low rainfall, hot, dry year. And so when we look at the yields from that year, this is kind of what the yields were restricted to, that in-season rainfall. But here's that irrigation. And so in order to carry that through, we did need extra irrigation. But that said, we're still not talking about irrigating a corn silage crop. We're going from 9 inches to 11 inches of irrigation. And so if you think about what does that 2 inches actually mean, 2 more inches of irrigation, depending on the well capacity, that can take up to 20 days to apply that. If you had a 300-gallon well on 120 acres and you're only able to make it pass, say, every 10 days based off of efficiency and whatever, I mean, that could potentially take you up to 20 days, and Nick could speak to that and correct that. But that's just something to think about. How long, and do you have the capacity to make that duration? Now this is actually looking at maturity, class, and yield in 2024 and the days to harvest that I mentioned. Now when I selected these hybrids, they were not necessarily because they were premier hybrids or the best hybrids. They were just hybrids that were definitely representative of those maturity classes. So here's an early maturing hybrid, 65 days to half bloom. Oh, okay. And then 84 days to harvest. So very, very fast. Now, there was that yield drag with it. We're looking at 15 tons per acre on a wet basis. Now, here's this S473, a photoperiod sensitive hybrid, 125 days to harvest, never really reached half bloom, but we're looking at the tonnage right there, 27.5 tons. Now, based off of the irrigation, this is kind of, you could average this out for forage sorghum because this early maturing hybrid had a lower yield, it had a lower water use efficiency, that pounds per inch of water applied. Because this higher, based off of the irrigation, had the highest yield, it didn't necessarily have the highest water use efficiency. On average, coming out to the highest, we're actually kind of in line with these medium maturing hybrids. And what I have seen is that when we talk about the nutritional value parameters, these medium maturing hybrids kind of really fit in the best of both worlds. You're looking at hybrids that have a good NDF. So if you think about, just that fraction of the forage and the NDF digestibility, but from an NDF standpoint, what we've seen with a lot of these is that you're around like 46% NDF. You still have good grain production, so you're 19 to 20% starch. And so they really do come out well. You just have to be paying attention to the harvest timing with that to make sure. And then here's looking at some of those values. So here's, kind of as we increase in production, this is tons on a dry matter basis, increasing in maturity, crude protein. Now, one of the things that I have seen with crude protein, and I think it's important to point out, is that I don't think this decline is genetic. I think it's simply a dilution because we're talking about the percent crude protein. Now, we have quite a bit more tonnage, almost double the tonnage. And so we need to be making sure we have our nitrogen levels meeting the forage demand in that. Lignin slightly more, but it's definitely not something that I think this historical consideration that forage sorghum has really high lignin, not necessarily the case. But what we do see is starch. We see a big decline in starch because we don't have the grain production. So we can balance stress with multiple maturity classes. And this goes back to that planting date discussion from last week. We talk about whether we're talking about water, heat, insects, splitting the planting dates can often be hard. But if we have the same planting date but two different maturity classes, well, now we're able to shift that pollination window so that we can shift that. And what we saw, this is actually a picture from our trial one year where we had some really extreme temperatures. We're looking at late July, we were reaching 110 degrees at Bushland. This was actually 2020. And so what I saw was that the hybrids that were pollinating, and even though sorghum is heat tolerant, those anthers are still susceptible to heat stress, and just like a silk on a corn ear, it's more heat tolerant, but still you will see the dehydration of that decreased pollen jet. And so right when that heat hit, all of a sudden everything below that was sterile. And so by having different maturity classes, here's a hybrid that pollinated before that heat came in. We have all the grain. Well, here was during the heat, and then later there was actually nothing because of the way that heat came. So splitting that maturity class gives you an ability to do that with early and later sorghums. One hybrid may miss the period of stress. Same thing with sugarcane aphids or with any disease. Flexibility with your harvest and helps mitigate that risk. So here's this comment that I made earlier with regards to the brown midribs. This is looking at digestibility. The orange dots are non-brown midribs, green dots are brown midribs. So the lower your ADF, the more digestible. The higher your in vitro true digestibility, the more digestible. And what we see is, over here, if we get down into this lower range, we have brown midribs and non-brown midribs that are all pretty good. But here, this green, you get out here, well, wait a second, you go buy one of these hybrids because it's a brown midrib. Well, honestly, these aren't that great, but it's marketed as a brown midrib, so you kind of think it's going to be a better hybrid. So that's where I think it's always important to ask the seedsman, what if they can provide you some indication about the digestibility of that. Lodging potential really does go back to management. Information on small grains, that's in there. So I know because of time, I'm just about that, but anybody can reach out to me and we can talk about any of this data and water use and